Natuurrampen in verschillende delen van de wereld hebben in de afgelopen weken enkele duizenden mensen het leven gekost. Van overstromingen tot orkanen in het Caribisch gebied, Zuid-Azië en West-Afrika. Behalve het menselijk leed zijn ook veel huizen en gebouwen totaal verwoest en de economische schade loopt in de miljarden US-dollars. Is klimaatverandering de oorzaak van deze extreme weersomstandigheden? Kijkt u naar een reportage met analyses van deskundigen via de Arabische satellietzender Al Jazeera.
It started with Hurricane Harvey and its catastrophic flooding and wind damage in the billions. Now all eyes are on 3 more hurricanes churning in the Atlantic. So what's causing all this? Is it climate change? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Ahelbarra. The past few weeks have seen catastrophic weather events around the world, from heavy monsoon rains and floodings in India, Nepal and Bangladesh to a landslide in Sierra Leone that killed 1,000 people. And last week, Hurricane Harvey dumped almost a year's worth of rainfall in the US city of Houston, destroying homes and causing billions in damage. Now, for the first time in 7 years, the Atlantic basin is facing 3 more hurricanes at the same time. Hurricane Irma has already caused widespread devastation across the Caribbean. The US state of Florida is poised for a direct hit. Hurricane Jose is following Irma, and the Caribbean islands are targeted once again. And Mexico is preparing for the impact of Hurricane Katia. So many are asking what's causing these weather events. Is it climate change? The answer may not be that simple. Researchers agree global warming is impacting the strength of these hurricanes and possibly their frequency. And scientists say rising ocean temperatures are intensifying these storms. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres addressed the issue this week.
The number of natural disasters has nearly quadrupled since 1970. The United Nations, the United States, followed by China and India, have experienced the most disasters since 1995. And last year alone, 24.2 million people were displaced by sudden onset disasters, 3 times as many as by conflict and violence.
Before we bring in our guest, let's have a closer look at what's causing climate change. The UN attributes it directly or indirectly to human activity, altering the composition of the global atmosphere. That includes pollution from industrial activity and other sources that produce greenhouse gases. These gases, including carbon dioxide, have the ability to absorb the spectrum of infrared light and contribute to the warming of our atmosphere. Once produced, the gases can remain trapped in the atmosphere for tens or hundreds of years. Let's bring in our panel. From Reading in the UK, Nigel Arnold, Professor of Meteorology at the University of Reading. Joining us on Skype from Marion in Massachusetts, Jennifer Francis from the Institute for Coastal and Marine Science at the Climate Institute at Rutgers University. And in Birmingham, Leon Seeley Huggins from the Global Sustainable Development Programme. Welcome to you all. Let me start by asking Jennifer Francis this. I was watching the media coverage of the hurricanes and those apocalyptic headlines like the most powerful storm ever recorded over the Atlantic, mega storms shattering lives, leaving behind billions of dollars in damage. Are we talking here about something quite different, a new weather pattern, a shift in the weather pattern?
Well, of course, we've had hurricanes before. We've had strong hurricanes before. But the fact that we're seeing this very strong hurricane right now, Hurricane Irma, as you said, one of the strongest we've ever seen in the Atlantic, does speak to the fact that we know we're changing the climate system. We know that there are certain ways that the climate is affecting tropical storms and all storms for that matter. We have warmer ocean temperatures, which is like giving the storms a bigger battery to draw energy from. We have more moisture in the atmosphere that they can wring out, like Harvey did on Houston, just unprecedented rains. And potentially we're seeing shifts in the atmospheric circulation itself, which may be leading to slow-moving storms like Harvey, which allowed it to dump so much rain in one place.
Which bears now the question, let me go to Mr. Arnold. Is there any connection here between the climate change and the occurrence of these massive storms that we're seeing now?
Well, it's very difficult to attribute an individual event to climate change, but what we rather do is look at to see whether the probabilities or the likelihoods of these events are changing. And I think there's lots of evidence that the likelihoods, the chance of these sorts of events occurring is changing over time. We know that global temperatures are rising, and we know that warmer air can hold more water, as we just heard. We know that sea surface temperatures are getting warmer, and the warmth in the water feeds the hurricanes, again, as we just heard. We know that sea level is rising as well. So when you get a hurricane and a storm surge, it's on a higher base level. So all those sort of add to the impact and consequences of a hurricane. But whether the hurricanes are being triggered because of climate change is a much more open question. We know that they're generated by patterns in the atmosphere, by circulation characteristics, and whether those are affected by climate change, we don't know yet. There's some good arguments that aspects of them that are relevant might be being affected by climate. So what we'll be able to say, I think, in the future is that climate change is altering the likelihood of experiencing hurricanes, but we can't say that Hurricane X or Hurricane Y was caused by climate change.
Mr. Huggins, now stories of cyclones and hurricanes in the Asian part of the world seem sometimes to be underreported, and that's where we have poverty and poor infrastructure. What's the concern about the safety of millions of people over there if there is a real change in the weather pattern?
Yes, well, one thing that we know is that Caribbean societies, Caribbean political leaders have been warning for decades that as climate change takes hold, Caribbean societies are particularly exposed to the impacts of this kind of weather event. And part of that exposure is patterned by political and social relations. So what I mean by that is that although the strength and intensity of the hurricane might be exacerbated by climate change, the extent to which an actual hurricane has a negative impact will depend partly on how well resourced those countries and societies are that are having to deal with the impacts of climate change. So it's whether or not the buildings are resilient enough to withstand high winds, it's whether or not there are proper drainage systems to allow the water to run off. And all of those are questions about how we organise our economy and societies.
Jennifer, now about the storm, particularly the Hurricane Harvey, what we've seen is that the storm amplifies further out in the ocean, then reaches its peak amplitude. The moment it gets into the landfall, it loses that intensity. This was not the case with Harvey. Completely unusual. Is this a new pattern that people should be really, you scientists should be really concerned about?
Well, I think I'd have to beg to differ a little bit with what you just said, because it is normal for when a hurricane comes on land that it loses its wind speed. So the winds generally drop. But it's very common for the precipitation and the rainfall to increase, because as those winds decrease, it allows the convection or the big thunderstorms and things in the storm to dump all that rain. So actually, it is expected to see a lot of rainfall happen when a tropical storm comes ashore. And, you know, whether we're seeing this being exacerbated, again, that goes back to the fact that we have a lot more moisture in the atmosphere now, thanks to those warming oceans, which goes back to, of course, the increasing greenhouse gases. And when those oceans warm, it allows more evaporation to occur, and we see a very clear increase in the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere over the last few decades.
Mr. Arnold, the scientific society seems to agree that the key elements that were conducive to the occurrence of the hurricanes and these massive storms is basically the huge amount of moisture in the air, the increase in the level of the sea, and also the ice sheet, which is shrinking. Aren't these elements which were more pronounced after the industrial era, which leads many people to say, you know what, this is something which is man-made?
Yeah, I think there's pretty conclusive evidence that the rise in temperature that we've seen is primarily caused by human activity and the consequent changes in the sea surface temperature and the consequent changes in the level of the sea. So that's pretty clearly well attributed to human activity and to the increasing use of greenhouse gas emissions over the last 150 years or so. So that's pretty well established.
Mr. Huggins, we're talking about the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres raising concern and alarm about these events taking place now in different parts of the world. What do you think, how should we move forward? What kind of contingency plans the international community should have to be able to cope with these new changes?
Yes, well, I think that's an incredibly important question. And in my own research, I've looked at the relationship between small island developing states, particularly those in the Caribbean, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of Parties that meets every year, supposedly to agree action on climate change, although what we've also seen with that process is that action has been extremely limited, and it's been somewhat inhibited by the kind of interplay of power relations between some of the major players. So famously, Donald Trump pulled out of the UN Paris Agreement, which is potentially very catastrophic for small island states.
Mm-hmm. Jennifer, and I would like you to correct me if I'm wrong about this, which is basically about Hurricane Harvey. The storm stalled over Houston, and which explains the relentless downpour, has been described by many as unusual. Do you think this is something that could be, in a way or another, connected with global warming?
Well, I think the jury is still out a bit on that, but there has been some recent research suggesting that, particularly over North America during the summertime, we're seeing the steering currents for tropical storms shifting northward. And so what's left is very weak steering currents. That's the trend anyway. So storms like Harvey, when they come into the Gulf of Mexico, have less winds that are there to move them along, like we've seen in the past happening more typically. So this particular example of Harvey, while we can't say that there's a direct connection to this tendency for weaker winds, certainly it was the case that they were weak, and that was the reason why it stayed in one place. And if we see this kind of tendency actually unfold in the future, then we should expect to see more storms like Harvey coming into the Gulf of Mexico and affecting North America just the way it did.
So, Mr. Arnell, are we likely to see more intense storms, floods, torrential rains in the coming years?
Well, climate change has two effects. One is the effect that we've already talked about, which is to make the atmosphere moister. So when it rains, you would expect it to rain more. So you would expect there to be more intense heavy rainfall in a cyclone or in the monsoon or in any other rainstorm. But the other effect, of the atmosphere which influences rainfall is the circulation, the way the pressure patterns move, the way the depressions and cyclones move. And that's much more difficult to project in climate change. We just heard that one of the reasons why Harvey was particularly slow moving was to do with the pressure gradients across North America. That's a circulation effect. And it's quite difficult to say exactly how those are going to change in the future. In some parts of the world it's more clear, in other parts it's more complicated. So we've got one definite signal of when it rains, it'll rain more. But competing against that, we've got the changes in the circulation patterns, which might exaggerate that effect or might offset it.
Mm-hmm. The hurricanes now are bringing back the whole debate between the climate change believers and climate change deniers. Mr. Huggins, do you think that this now will bring an opportunity for the international community to try to come up with a coordinated or a united front to deal with the changes in the weather patterns?
I would like to be able to say yes in response to that question, because that's precisely what is needed, is a coordinated international response. Unfortunately, if you look at the kind of interaction of relations between world powers, if you look at the history of trying to reach a global agreement that serves the interests of the poorer nations as well as those of the rich, we don't have a particularly good track record to go on. So the Caribbean nations and small island states have been calling for an absolute upper limit to warming of 1.5 degrees C. And we're actually on course for upwards of 3 degrees by some projections, although it's unclear. And that's partly to do with the fact that we are constantly, repeatedly failing to address some of the inequalities that pattern the relationships at the global governance level. So what that means is that bigger countries have more of a say in the negotiations, and they're able to shape the discussions in their own interest at the expense of those countries which are more exposed and vulnerable.
Jennifer, would you like to add anything about it?
Well, I agree with everything he just said, and I think it's a two-pronged effort. Of course, we need to do everything we can do to reduce the source of the problem. It's really the disease is this increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is due to mainly human activities. But the other aspect is, places like Houston. Part of the reason why the damage is so great is that they have basically ignored development zoning. And so they keep rebuilding in the same places that get flooded without any real thoughtful changes to the way they build. And that's true of many places.
We'll talk a little bit later about the adaptation strategies. Mr. Arnell, the Paris climate change was seen basically as the best chance for the global community to try to tackle the global warming, but with the United States of America pulling out from the deal, do you have any concerns that this is something that could pose many challenges for the international community and for you, the scientist community?
Well, the Paris Agreement was clearly incredibly powerful and very important, and it is, I think, on the first sight, a big shame that the American government has said it's going to pull out. I think we need to wait and see as to whether they actually will or not. I think it's a while away before any withdrawal can take effect. And I think, looking positively, I think a lot of the individual states are very keen on reducing their emissions for all sorts of economic and reducing pollution reasons. So I'm not quite as pessimistic about the future direction of climate policy as others. Having said that, the Paris Agreement does put very, very challenging targets on global governments and so on. It is feasible just about to keep the limit in temperature to 1.5 degrees, but it's very difficult, and I think the ambitions that countries have put in place to try and meet these targets need to be ramped up in order to have a greater chance of hitting the target. But I think there's lots of optimism, that at least in the US, the states will sort of step up. They've already declared that they're not going to they're going to keep within the spirit of the Paris Agreement, even if the federal government withdraws.
Okay, so now with Mr. Huggins, with the sea levels expected to rise in the coming decades to unprecedented levels, putting a huge threat on coastal cities that could find themselves underwater, isn't this the right moment for developers all over the world to try to come up with a contingency plan to cope with this new reality?
Yes, definitely, and I was pleased to hear the other contributor mention the kind of sort of maladaptive development that's taking place in Houston, where people are building on zones that are known to be vulnerable. One of the problems that we have when we think and talk about climate change is that we have a relatively well-developed sense of large aspects of the geophysics and the kind of meteorological aspects of the processes. However, the sociological, the political, and the other social scientific aspects are fairly underdeveloped. So one thing that we are unable to answer, or not as well able to answer, is the question of why is it that developers continue to build in these zones that are known to be prone to flooding and vulnerability. And that's partly to do with the fact that the way we organize our society does not take into account the interests of those who are most exposed and most vulnerable, and it prioritized the making of profit, the kind of a kind of free market approach to development that makes it very difficult to enforce those kinds of policies that you rightly identify as being necessary.
But again, let me go now to Jennifer. With the global economic recession, isn't this going to be more of a challenge to try to allocate funds to be able to implement robust adaptation strategies in places at high risk, like Houston, like Miami, like places in the Caribbean, in different parts of the world?
Well, of course, it's a challenge. It's always a challenge because it's a very expensive proposition. But on the other hand, it's the taxpayers. I mean, we always talk about the government stepping in and rebuilding a city. But what is the government? Where's that money coming from? It's coming from all the rest of us who are paying our taxes to rebuild people's homes in places where they really shouldn't be. They're just going to get wiped out again in many cases. So, you know, it is a question of resources. But on the other hand, even with a recession or coming out of a recession, it's economically much more sensible to start talking about some of these hard decisions. And they are hard. And I live in a small town on the coast in Massachusetts where we're incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise and to hurricanes and to other storms. And even in a little town like this where everybody knows each other, it's a really hard conversation to have.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Arnold, if we can manage in the near future to maintain the recommendations or implement the recommendations of the Paris climate deal, are we going to be able to turn the chapter in a way or to reverse this trend and ensure that in the near future we won't have massive or mega storms?
Well, I'm afraid the answer to that is no. Even if we do manage to hit the targets, the 1.5 degree increase in temperatures that are in the Paris Agreement, that still leaves our climate different to what it has been over the last 20 or 30 years and which we've become used to. So we will still have, even in a post-Paris world, more floods, more droughts, more heat waves than we have at the present. Not as many as we would have if we just let everything rip, but even with the full implementation of the Paris Agreement, there will be some sea level rise, there will be some climate impact, and that tells us that we really do need to take adaptation incredibly seriously. And as we've already heard, there are lots of economic and political and social and cultural obstacles to reducing vulnerability to these sorts of events that we can expect will happen more frequently. Mm-hmm. The challenge is to try and work out how to overcome these political, economic, social obstacles. And one of the problems is that just looking at them as an economic issue or a political issue isn't enough. It's all of the above. We need to look at all of these different factors when trying to work out how best to reduce vulnerability.
Mr. Huggins, the international community and its organizations were able to raise international awareness about challenges we've been facing for many years, diseases, plagues, and economic or social problems. Is it going to be easy this time to seize the opportunity and teach and educate the world about the dangers we face if we don't act together to try to cope with the new reality on the ground?
Well, I do think that the prominence that's given to, for example, this issue, the Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Harvey, is in a way encouraging if it's distressing that we're having to pay attention to this kind of catastrophe. It's encouraging that, for example, your own channel is recording this broadcast. It's encouraging that I have seen a lot of very excellent commentary by colleagues in academia who've been writing about this kind of thing. I think that has to be weighed against some of the other broader trends, and some of those broader trends are those such as Donald Trump choosing to reopen the Dakota Access Pipeline last week and celebrating this kind of deal that will see the flow of oil increase. So I think there are positives and negatives. Overall, I think we have to fight. We have to push for this to be an issue on the agenda.
Staying with the positive, and this is going to be my last question to Jennifer. Jennifer, this is looks like an unprecedented moment with all these hurricanes and weather changes. Is this likely to sort of lead to the scientific community to expand further its researchers, invest further into satellite technology to be able to at least predict events to happen in the future?
Well, I sure hope so. We haven't seen that being the case lately. Budgets have been cut to most of our major scientific entities. So, you know, right now it's not looking all that optimistic, but I think, as was just said, I think these events, while horrible, are getting people talking and getting people asking questions about, wow, this is really different now. We've never seen this before. Why is that? So it's opening the door for discussions like this to help people understand, you know, we are learning a lot about how the climate changes are affecting our everyday lives, our everyday weather. And so I see that as a silver lining to all this terrible destruction that we're seeing happening around the world, not just these hurricanes that are affecting our neighborhood, but as was already mentioned, the floods and droughts and heat waves and fires in Europe and Eurasia this summer and in past summers, and even winter cold snaps and heavy snowfalls. There are connections to all of these things. I think they're all helping people to understand better these connections.
Thanks to all our guests, Nigel Arnell, Jennifer Francis and Leon Seeley Huggins.
Nangawampinga nomo brabu no kanya eju anu orele kispo nyame nanga pinga yusa ondro pemi kutru manasari kutru wanga nunomo boto no salo eju pari lona botogo